Hey everybody, how are you today? Happy Friday. So, we're going to be moving into the last section of Chapter 7 today. So, we're going to be talking about crime. And as we go through Chapter 7, Section 3, there's going to be some essential questions that we're going to be talking about. In today's lesson, all you really have to do today is watch the lecture and take notes. If you haven't finished the Theories of Deviance worksheet yet, you're going to want to get that done by midnight tonight. If you've noticed though, I haven't been taking any points off for late work. So if you don't get it done till tomorrow, it's not the end of the world. It's not like I'm going to be awake at 12:01 to check and make sure you turn it in. Yes, it does tell me if you turn it in late, but I've been pretty generous lately about it being late. I really want you to watch the lecture, take notes, but focus on your project, get it done. Email me if you have questions. Remember, project is due on Tuesday. You're going to want to turn in the Google Slides as well as the Google Doc with your works cited reference page. Please don't put that in a Google slide. You can't get the proper formatting right. You're also going to want to record your presentation in Screencast-O-Matic or something like that. And probably like Saturday or Sunday, I'll post, Tuesday's agenda, and then you can already start to post your actual project. If you want to present live during Tuesday's Google Meet, please let me know. Otherwise, everybody should be doing a recording of their presentation. Remember, next week there's 2 Google Meets. There'll be one Tuesday at 9:30, and then on Wednesday the 16th at 10:15. Tuesdays we'll be wrapping up the project and kind of wrapping up our discussion of crime and journals and such. Wednesdays will be focused more so on reviewing for the test. The last actual lecture will also come out on Tuesday, and you'll watch that, you'll take notes, and you'll go ahead and do the last journal. Journals will be due on next Wednesday, the 16th. So you should be caught up at this point with 9 of them, and I'll give you the last 10th one to do on Tuesday, and then you'll turn those in on Wednesday. I'll also be posting, I'm not sure if I'll do it today, I have to go to the doctor today, but I will be posting the review questions here in the next couple of days, and you'll have your 10 review questions due, I've got them right now on the agenda as due Wednesday. I can always push that back to Thursday or Friday next week. I know you can be really busy with it being the last week of the semester. But you'll have your review questions due. I'll be giving you a participation grade, so make sure you come to one of those Google Meets. And then you'll have your test next week on Class Marker, and that'll wrap up our class. Now you're also going to need to turn in your textbook next week. I'll be putting a box, probably starting Monday, in kind of right by the main office. If you've tried to go to the school at all, you'll notice that before you even go into the main office, you of course have to get like buzzed in. And then there's like all sorts of boxes in that hallway. A lot of kids have been dropping off art supplies there or stuff for AP Bio and things like that. I'll have a box there which says sociology textbooks, and you'll be turning in your book next week. I really need you to turn those back in so that second semester kids, I'll have enough textbooks. And so that's about it. Make sure if you have any missing work, you get that done. Grades are not technically due till after Christmas break, but you want everything turned in by the 18th. It'll be hard, to remember what we're doing after Christmas, and you're going to be in all new classes and schedules. All right, so let's get into crime. So what we're going to talk about here in section 3 is we're going to kind of review, why do people commit crimes? Because at this point, I'm hoping you have an idea of that, but we're going to kind of review that. And then we're going to talk mostly about today, about what are the different types of crimes. Are you familiar with those? I'm not sure how much of a CSI crime show junkie you are. I'm sure everybody in this class has watched one. America has a fascination with crime shows. I saw a good meme the other day which says, I'm either slaying or slaying, because that's literally what's kind of on my Netflix at the moment. I'm either watching like CSI type shows where people are getting, they're slaying, they're killing someone, or I'm watching Christmas shows. We'll talk a little bit about, does crime pay? Who's really getting caught and punished for these crimes? We'll talk about, what is the role of the criminal justice system, how it works a little bit, some of its successes, some of its failures with racial profiling and police brutality. We'll talk more about that. That'll be the focus of our last journal on Monday when we talk about racial profiling, police brutality, George Floyd's death. And then we'll talk a little bit about what is the role of the prison system? Is it to rehabilitate someone, which is really the focus in some countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland, or is it about retribution? Is it about punishment? Is it about vengeance? And what about the ultimate sanction? The death penalty is, of course, the ultimate punishment, the ultimate sanction. they say that it's in place because people deserve to get truly punished for their crimes if they're monsters and such. I don't know if monsters is a term that you agree with, but that's literally the wording that you'll see people use. Is it a deterrent for crimes? That's what they also claim, that the death penalty is in place because it deters people from doing violent crimes. Or is it a cruel and unusual punishment that violates the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution? So we're just really going to focus on 1 and 2 today, and then we'll kind of do an overview of 3, 4, 5, 6 on Monday. Obviously, if we had more time and we were in kind of a normal life pre-COVID, we would get into more depth on some of these. But we'll kind of touch base. And I know some of you think it's interesting and some of you don't, but that's kind of how sociology is. I'm hoping you're starting to understand that this class covers so much stuff that we can talk about parenting to crime to other countries' culture. If we had more time in this class, was a year on, we would talk about so much stuff. So I'm hoping at this point that you're starting to understand that there's many reasons why people commit crimes, and that once upon a time there was actually even a nature-nurture mentality where, some people thought that like people were born as killers or as criminals, and that like criminals even had certain like biological features with like square noses and big jaws and certain muscular builds. Most people have gotten beyond that now and understand that, when it comes to the criminal element, it has a lot to do with nurture. It has a lot to do with the environment you're raised in. Now, remember, due today, as I said, by midnight is the graphic organizer worksheet about the different theories of deviance. But remember, functionalists say that deviance actually serves a purpose in our country, and that it's important that people are deviant or that they commit crimes, that they violate our social norms, our mores that we feel so strongly about. We've turned them into laws because they help clarify the norms for the rest of us, and they help unify us as a group, and they help us to release some tensions and to, show us what's wrong with our society. And Durkheim was the first to really talk about the sense of a nome, and he talked about this going all the way back to what life was like in France as he was doing his suicide studies, as the economy was changing and as they were starting to industrialize. And he said that as many people moved to a city compared to a country, they often felt isolated, they felt alone, they were experiencing new norms and meeting new people. And as they, were kind of off on their own, they often felt this anome or this normlessness where, they weren't the person that they used to be. They were not familiar with these new sense of norms. They didn't necessarily fit in, and they struggled, to fit in. And if they could not cope, perhaps they turned to crime. Perhaps they turned to deviant acts to try to fit in, so to speak, or they turned to deviance because they saw others doing it. They thought they could get away with it. Or they thought they simply wouldn't be caught because they had that anonymity, so to speak. And remember, Strain also talked about this, that, really and truly, that most people do follow society's norms, but there are those 5 modes of adaptation. And, those 4 other modes really focus on, people who are not following society's norms. And one in particular, those innovators do turn to crime, to try to follow society's, goals, but in untraditional paths, so to speak. And usually, it's the idea that people have this desire for the wealth, for the goods, and they either don't think they're going to get caught, they think that they have a killer plan. They've been taught that crime is an acceptable method, and that kind of gets more into the symbolic interactionist view. Remember, that's kind of that functionalist view overall. Remember, those conflict theorists, they say that crime has always occurred and will always occur because there's inequality, not just in American society, but Karl Marx talked about this going back into the 1800s. There's inequality in all societies. There are differences between rich and poor, between black and white, between social groups, economic groups, races, and people will fight for power. And the people who are in power, they want to maintain power. And they, in a sense, do influence the police force and control it in some ways and tell, the police and the lawmakers, you really need to find people who commit theft or violent crimes. You need to, persecute these people. You need to punish these people. And of course, that information is also what is publicly on the news, and that is what is then what they fear. And so if all the attention is on the lower classes committing crimes, you basically will be putting them away, putting them in jail, and then hence they can't, steal power from the upper classes. And it also kind of does a bit of misdirection, almost kind of like a magic show act. And it makes people forget that the upper classes, the wealthy, are just as likely to commit crimes as the lower classes. It's not like, crime knows any race, any color, or it's more likely in one particular group. Of course, we know that certain groups are more likely to get arrested, but it doesn't mean that other groups are, more likely to commit a crime. Now, when it comes to our symbolic interactionists, remember, they're focused on what happened in terms of the person's, relationships, in terms of who they knew, the cultural environment they were raised. How did that lead them to a life of crime? And they're also, of course, like with labeling theory, interested with how a label of crime really impacts that individual, as far as a primary level of deviance, that kind of label is just they committed a few crimes, but they're not truly a deviant. They don't have that stigma. They shouldn't be treated differently. Perhaps they weren't caught in the act. Perhaps it was not a major crime, compared to secondary deviance, where someone is truly labeled as a deviant. They've committed multiple crimes, they've been caught in the act, and then of course that label will have a lasting impact on their life, where it might be difficult for them to get a job, they can't vote, they're labeled a felon, etc. And remember that control theory was all about the idea that most people do conform to society's norms. They do what they're supposed to do. It kind of reinforces that 90-90 rule, that 90% of the time people are doing what they're supposed to do. And it's the whole mentality that the more integrated a person is in society, the less likely they will commit a crime. The differential association theory, which was really at the heart of the other one, really talked about how the more likely that a person spent time in a community where crime was thought of as normal, and they had more criminal associations and interactions with those people, it meant that they were more likely to commit crime. And the only other theory that we looked at as far as why people commit crimes was in terms of social psychology. Remember, sociology focuses on the group, psychology focuses on the individual choices. Milgram in particular, remember, he realized with his Milgram experiment that even, quote unquote, normal people, so to speak, even people who, feel that they are integrated into society, who don't have connections with criminals, who don't have any past behavior of criminal acts, are still likely to follow orders and do things that are criminal if, they are not seeing the impact on the victim, and if they have been told to do so by an authority figure and they are afraid to speak out from the group. There is that mentality still in most group settings of groupthink, where people are, afraid to really stand out. People are always willing to pass the blame on someone else, especially if they feel that it's not their responsibility for what's happening. And in a sense, it kind of reminds me of, the bystander effect, really and truly, that if someone sees, someone hurt, if they're the only one around, they're likely to help. But if there's a whole group of people, they simply assume that someone else will help. So there's a whole lot of interesting things that happen as far as how people behave when they're by themselves compared to when they're in a group. So now we're going to, now that we had a nice little review, we're going to get into, and hopefully that kind of helped you with your worksheet if you weren't done yet. Let's get into crime itself. So remember, crime is basically an act that is labeled as such by those in authority, meaning police officers, but really it's about your policymakers, your legislators at the state level, at the federal level. It's any act that has been prohibited by law. So it's someone who is violating a norm that we've felt so strongly about. It has some kind of moral significance usually, and we've turned it into a law. And of course, there's going to be some kind of consequence or negative sanctions if you violate said law. And it's an act that is punishable by the government. So really and truly, there's 5 different types of crime. And we're going to go through those 5 types today. And then in the next lecture on Tuesday, I'll go through the rest of the chapter. So I like a little chart I found, and this kind of, to me, sums it all up. Okay, you've got crimes against property. So like arson, somebody's burning down your house, burglary, somebody's stealing your stuff, vandalism, somebody's ruining your stuff and spray painting on there, shoplifting, you own a store, someone's stealing your stuff. You've got crimes against an individual, right? So someone has assaulted you, right? They've hit you, they've kidnapped you, they're holding you at gunpoint, someone murders you, they blackmail you, right? So you have to pay them unless they're going to tell the world your secrets. They pickpocket you, so to speak, they mug you, they take your wallet. Fraud, we'll talk more about here coming up, but they've misrepresented themselves in some way to gain some kind of benefit from you. Perhaps they've committed identity theft and they've stolen, your identity, and they try to, then go ahead and, steal your wealth from your bank account. And then crimes against others, when people are smugglers, right? And, they don't want to pay taxes, so they are smuggling goods into the US, whether they are legal goods or illegal goods like drugs. They are hijacking people, weapons, from one place to another. Cyber crimes, okay? So cyber crimes go into a whole category of stuff, right? Where they could be stealing your bank account information, your passwords, anything like that. Speeding, okay? Because obviously, if you are speeding, and not just like speeding 5 miles over the limit, we're talking about people who are going, 120. If you're going 120, you're going too fast. Please slow down. You're going to get a ticket. You're going to cause reckless driving. All it takes is for you to get distracted for 1 second, or for some, idiot to pull out in front of you. And the next thing you know, you're in a horrific car crash and your life's going to flash before your eyes. Please don't drive that fast. And please, if you're on a motorcycle, wear a helmet. Okay, so speeding, though, obviously could potentially injure others if it's at a high speed. Drunk driving, of course. I like that picture. It was a great picture I found on Google, but I see it says drink driving. That's kind of funny. Littering, any kind of pollution, any kind of hooliganism. So, usually hooliganism, like drinking, like dancing on tables, throwing things, breaking things, almost going into vandalism more. And illegal parking really doesn't truly hurt others unless, you're parking instead of a fire hydrant, things like that. You're trying to impede areas where police officers, fire department, things like that need to get to. So that kind of helps it sum it up in my mind as far as crimes and who it's really kind of hurting. But let's go through the different categories. So violent crimes is the first one. And I think that's the one we're probably the most all familiar with, because if you've ever watched an episode of Law and Order, CSI, any of those shows, they're all about murder. And they've got forcible rape and robbery and aggravated assault, aggravated assaults, which physical attacks on someone. They talk more about this on page 171 in your text. Americans, of course, are obsessed with learning about murderers, serial killers. It piques our fascination. It sells TV show tickets. It sells, movie tickets. And honestly, it leads to all sorts of interesting views by psychologists and sociologists. Like, one of the big things that psychologists and sociologists study then is, what's the impact of violent crime? If people play violent video games, if people watch violent movies, will it lead to violent behavior? And this is a topic that they go back and forth about constantly. I think I've written at least 2 research papers over the years about this. One, I remember writing one in college, in fact, and it was about what impact does violent television have on children? And back then, so this is, 2001, guys, 2002, there used to be this show on MTV called Beavis and Butthead. And they were 2 idiots, and they would, just be ridiculous. Light stuff on fire, do all sorts of stupid things. And so the idea was, if young kids, so we're talking about tweens and teens, if they watch shows like this, will it lead to violent behavior? And of course, as we've seen more school shootings occur, that's been a continued topic. As kids play violent video games, right, that are so realistic, does that lead to violent behavior? And you're going to find psychologists and sociologists on both sides of the spectrum who continue to say yes and who continue to say no. So if you're ever going into crime in college or studying sociology or psychology, they're going to continue to debate and discuss that. Because as we just talked about in terms of crime and in terms of differential association theory, they say that the more that you're around criminal behavior and it becomes normal, you're more likely to act that way, because in your mindset, that's perfectly acceptable. So yet again, there's people out there who adhere to Bandura's learning theory and say that, well, if you've learned that violence is natural, you're more likely to act that way. That kind of goes back to Harlow and our parenting theories and things like that. Remember we talked about how the monkeys were isolated and then they had trouble kind of reintegrating with their family. And if they'd learned isolation and violence, they would be more likely to act out against others. So yet again, if you've watched it on TV and you've learned this sense of behavior, will you be more likely to commit violent acts? So that's one of those things that people continue to study, and psychologists in particular try to look into the minds, the psyche of criminals, and figure out, did you react that way because it was taught to you? You thought it was normal, because you were getting vengeance? What was the motive behind that? So that's kind of violent crime. As far as crimes against property would be, of course, a burglar. Years ago, McDonald's, I don't know if you guys ever remember this, used to have like all sorts of cute characters. One of them was the Hamburglar, and he looked like a burglar, and he had these like ridiculous goggles on. I don't know if he was a raccoon. I don't know exactly what kind of creature he was, but he would steal your hamburgers. There was also Grimace and all sorts of cute things. And McDonald's used to be like fun when I was little, and it had like a play place and had like fun chairs and I don't know, like characters and like, yeah, I don't know, just remind me of the Hamburglar. But in all reality, burglary, so larceny, which basically means any kind of theft of your property, if people are, burning down your home, if they're stealing your car, and of course, whether we're talking about violent crime or a crime against your property, these are, of course, all considered felonies, which are the things that, for the most part, are going to make it difficult, where you're going to spend longer time in imprisonment in terms of incarceration. It's going to be harder for you to get a job. Some states have restrictions that you can't vote. Of course, there's some restrictions about perhaps where you can reside, where you can live in a community. So these are the ones that are going to have the lasting stigma of secondary, in terms of labeling, because they're all considered secondary deviants. As far as violent crime rates, sometimes people think that America is, because we're obsessed with violent crime and we watch it all the time on television, sometimes people think that like violent crime is just out of control in America. If you look at our crime rates and our use of guns and the amount of murders we have in the US compared to other countries, especially like England, Australia, or Norway, or Sweden, yes, it is like off the charts in terms of violent crime and murders compared to some of these other countries. But in reality, despite our fascination with watching violent crimes on television, they're actually down. You see that huge rise in the 60s and 70s, and even all the way up into the 90s. But somewhere, in the mid 90s, we started to see that we hit this peak, and then it really starts to drop. It goes up again in the early 2000s, but then it's kind of leveled off. Yet again, why does it, rise and fall? That's something that psychologists and sociologists study. Sociologists, in terms of looking at trends, they say that, it really has to do with economic status in America. It has to do with changing values. It has to do with political protest movements. So as people are responding and reacting to economic and political changes in our country, sometimes they perhaps respond violently. Now, if we're looking at the crimes overall, what you're seeing in orange there is that the vast majority of crimes, and this was taken from Crime in the United States, this was from 2016. It included data from Puerto Rico and District of Columbia, and it was from the FBI Uniform Crime Reports. And so they said that about 63% of the crimes committed were all related to theft or larceny in some cases. Then you saw about 16% were burglary cases, 9% were aggravated assault, straight up robbery only made up about 3%. 1% of the crimes were rape with a revised definition. And then when it comes to, I can't tell what that one is, 0% of the crimes were, sorry guys, motor vehicle theft, all right? What is that one? That blue one is, 8% are motor vehicle theft, which means that 0% of the crimes are actually murder, non-negligent manslaughter. Okay, sorry there. Got a little distracted for a second. So when most people think that the crimes that are happening in the US are violent crimes because they're seeing that on television, that's not actually the case. Most of the crimes are related to wealth, people trying to acquire money. There's some kind of theft in one way or the other. And especially in modern times, if you notice, they're not considered burglary, because you might be like, well, isn't burglary the same as theft? Not necessarily. Motor vehicle theft is obviously one type. Burglary is they're actually coming into your house, but in modern times, most of the theft is actually happening online in terms of identity theft and trying to break into your account and steal your wealth in that way. But as far as violent crimes, like what you're thinking of, as far as murder and rape, those are all much lower percentages than perhaps what you thought. Now let's talk about victimless crime. Victimless crime, it sounds strange, but they say that it is a crime to participate in prostitution, to participate in gambling in some states, to obviously take illegal drugs. Some states have laws against vagrancy, which is homelessness or loitering, so just basically hanging around on someone's property. But those are technically what we call victimless crimes because they're not really hurting someone else. If the prostitute is willing to engage in that act, and the other person is paying to receive that act, neither one is technically a victim. Now, if the prostitute was in some way forced in terms of sex trafficking, that's a different story. When it comes to gambling, it's the same way. If it's illegal to gamble, and we're talking about like big, illegal kind of gambling, betting rings, things like that, yet again, you're the one who's choosing to spend your money and to make that bet. Or if you're choosing to buy illicit drugs like, cocaine or heroin, whatever it may be. So, but they're saying that's victimless crime because you're the one who's, truly choosing to do this. Organized crime is more like the mafia or like a gang, something that we don't have a whole lot of experience with in Henry County, or as I live in Scott County, Iowa. But, living in the Chicago burbs, you have organized crime, right? So you have gangs. You've got people who are usually doing illegal drug trafficking. They could be participating in burglary. They could be participating in murder. Some gangs have initiations where you have to kill someone to get in or kill a police officer. They could be giving out loans and loan sharking, breaking someone's legs, beating them up, killing them if they don't repay those loans. So that's organized crime. And usually, of course, see, larger gang or years ago, like the mafia being more predominant, still so like on the East Coast or in Chicago, the crime syndicates. That's, one type of crime, but that's, something that doesn't really affect the country as a whole. The last type, which you might not know much about, is white collar crime. And as I said before, most of the crimes that you see on television, for the most part, because I love to watch crime shows, I watch them all, it seems like, a lot of the crimes are focusing on, rape and murder. Because, it's interesting to try to figure out who's the killer, who is the serial killer. It holds people's attention, in a television show, in a movie theater. But really and truly, white collar crimes are on the rise. And it's the idea that people who are wealthy, people who work in offices, not people who are poor, people who are trafficking drugs. We're talking about people who are looking to scam money off of rich people. They're on the rise. And also they've thrown cyber crimes into this category as well because they don't usually involve the same type of means of deception or the same type of criminal acts. So let's talk about a few of them. So one of them, of course, is embezzlement, the idea that you're withholding assets. So you are trying to, in some way, commit a type of fraud, and you are trying to, steal money, perhaps from a company. And so if someone is in charge of petty cash, basically, petty cash could be something like if there's funds at a corporation or at a business where they say, okay, we're going to, if it's somebody's birthday, we're going to spend money on a petty cash to buy a birthday cake that day. Or, okay, everybody had a great day at work or we had a hard week. We're going to spring and buy pizzas for lunch. There could be like some kind of petty cash fund. If someone decides to all of a sudden start faking it and start saying that the cost of those pizzas for the luncheon or birthday cakes were double, triple the price, and they start stealing that money, usually, we're not talking about someone physically stealing the cash, more so that they're, putting it into some offshore account in the Cayman Islands, in the Caribbean, in Switzerland, and where that won't be tracked as easily. But that's embezzling money. You are stealing money. You are committing some type of fraud. You are misrepresenting yourself, are misrepresenting what you're doing for the benefit. There was just a case, I think about 2 years ago in Dixon, Illinois. about a woman who worked for the city who misrepresented how the money was being spent for the city, and she embezzled, gosh, I think it was like $1 million or something like that. So basically what we're getting at is that someone who is in a high social status, they're in a position of power or wealth or influence, even if they're not rich themselves, but they are finding a way to steal money from some company, organization, the government. At the same point, tax evasion, I think you're familiar with, someone's not paying appropriate taxes. Cyber crimes are really interesting. So cyber crimes are so many different things. It could be some kind of online scam, right? Where there's some kind of robocall that's calling you and saying, you've won a trip to the Caribbean. Simply click pound, dial this number, type in the last 4 digits of your social security number, give us access to all of your bank account information, and we'll give you that check. It'll come in 4 to 6 weeks and you'll get $1 million. Obviously, don't ever give out your social security number. If you don't know it yet, you should memorize it. Don't ever give out your bank account information. Don't give people who call on the phone or anybody like that your personal information or your credit card numbers. But is it identity theft goes in this category? Some kind of scam, any kind of cyber stalking, people who are trying to, overwhelm websites so they shut down. There's so many different kind of attacks as far as cyber crimes, but identity theft is definitely one thing that people think of as far as someone trying to basically steal your identity because you've thrown away different papers. That's why they encourage you to shred them or to burn them. Websites, companies have, hired all sorts of, ex-hackers and people like that to try to, provide better security and make sure that your information is safe, but it still happens all the time. And people try to basically assume your identity, so to speak, so that they can drain your bank account. It's why really and truly, as you turn 18, it's safer to use, a credit card to make purchases online compared to a debit card, where if they stole your information, they could drain your debit card. Whereas Visa or your credit card companies, they'll put your money back into your account. They'll find that they're fraudulent charges. They'll text you, they'll send you messages, they'll check on it. Compared to a debit card, if your money's gone from your account, it's simply gone. The police can try to get that money back, but sometimes it takes months and sometimes they never get it back with identity theft. So it's pretty difficult. Last thing I want to talk about with fraud and white collar crime is really and truly that, it happens more than you think. And it's really what people who, for the most part, are, considered respectable and trustworthy. And, they do so many different things. So basically, there's a graft happening all around us, or basically a type of fraud where you are using, illegal, illicit, means to try to influence people's positions. So you're perhaps bribing public officials to do what you want. And we see that, businessmen are constantly donating money to politicians' re-election campaigns or PACs, political action committees, to make sure that, basically they're saying, hey, look, I'm going to give you money, I'm going to get you reelected, but please don't kind of pass any laws, that will impact my company in any way, shape, or form. But there's all sorts of, corporate crimes, which are constantly happening. And basically what we're getting at is that, yet again, it doesn't matter if you're black, white, if you're rich, poor, people commit crimes, especially if they think that they can get away with it. We know that Sears company, which Sears is kind of falling apart. We had Sears years ago, but now I don't think they still have one by JCPenney at North Park Mall anymore or anything like that. But they defrauded the poor. In case you don't realize, Sears is like another department store like Kohl's or anything like that, or JCPenney. And they ended up basically stealing about $100 million from their investors. Usually, corporate crime is kind of overlooked. For example, Firestone. Firestone basically allowed faulty tires to remain on American cars. They were being recalled in Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, but they weren't being recalled in America because they knew that Americans would freak out, that nobody would buy their tires, that it would lead to huge losses, that their stock prices would go down, and eventually 200 Americans died. And so companies are focused on their own wealth. They refuse to issue, and you might be thinking, well, don't they issue recalls? They do, but they usually only issue recalls after a ton of people die. Same thing when it comes to food safety or car safety. So you have to trust your gut in life. And if you ever feel like something is wrong, you need to trust your gut and go with it, because in all reality, they're focused on themselves and their own profit. And so Americans, for the most part, are concerned more so with street crime and with violent crime and thinking they're going to be attacked by a stranger. But in all reality, there's corporate crime going on around us quite all the time. Just so you can kind of see the image here. Oh, as far as where is violent crime the worst, Illinois is definitely on that radar, but from where we live, it's not the biggest problem. Chicago is what's really impacting that. Last thing to talk about here is Bernie Madoff. And I'm not sure if you've ever heard of Bernie Madoff before, but he's been in the news throughout your lifetime because he's an incredibly intelligent man and was an incredibly rich man. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science, which is government civics, in 1960. He used money from his relatives, and he created a company called Bernie Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, where he basically said, I will find out what stocks are hot, and if you give me money and you invest with my company, we will buy stocks in your name. And as the stock prices go up, you will get a return. You will make huge amounts of money. And then, of course, as long as the stocks are going up, you'll make money. And I promise you huge return rates. And eventually, whenever you want to sell your stock, feel free, but you'll never want to sell it or leave my company from handling, your stocks, because I'll continue to make you tons of money. And he actually attracts all sorts of big name clients: Kevin Bacon, Steven Spielberg, Kyra Sedgwick, all sorts of people. In the 1980s and into the 1990s, this man controlled 5% of all of the stocks that were being traded on the New York Stock Exchange. His company was in control of that. Well, it turns out, December 11th of 2008, he finally admits to an investor as he's getting old and sick that this is a Ponzi scheme, and his sons find out and they throw him in jail. They turn him in. In case you don't know what a Ponzi scheme is, this really kind of helps explain it to you. But basically, it's named after the man in the picture there, who was Ponzi, the original Ponzi schemer from the 1920s. And you basically go ahead and you tell, to investors, you say, I have a foolproof plan for making you money. And if anyone ever says that to you, that's a scam to begin with. There's no foolproof plans in life. But they'll say, I will double your investment. All you have to do is give me $1,000 and give me a month and you'll have $2,000. So you find two investors, you take their money, you scam a bit off the top. Then in the next month, basically, or in the next week, really, you find 4 more suckers, 4 more investors, and you basically take their money and you use it to repay the first 2 guys. So now you have $4,000, and you're going to give that $4,000 back to the first 2 original investors. And then the subsequent weeks, you get, 8 investors, and you use their money to repay the original, 4 investors, and so forth. And so it keeps going and it keeps going and keeps going. So, by the 10th round, the Ponzi schemer will need to find a group of 1,024 investors. By the 18th round, he'll have to come up with over 250,000 investors. So you keep getting more people, and you're using the new investment money that you've gotten from the new group to repay the old group of investors, basically, which is pretty crazy. And of course, you're skimming some money off the top. But eventually, the Ponzi scheme unravels because you need more and more investors, and you need to ask them to give more and more money to kind of show the previous groups that they should continue to invest. But as things happen, as there's changes in the market and other groups drop out, you're going to have to pay people back their money if they choose to leave. And eventually more people find out about it, the police start to get interested, and the whole scheme kind of falls apart. In 2009, Bernie Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 felony counts of fraud, basically, right, of misrepresenting himself, of lying, of perjury, of lying to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he was only forced to serve a 10-year sentence and is eligible for parole in January 2017, which I believe was denied. And I've got a little video clip that'll talk about that as well. Technically, he got a life sentence of 150 years. All right, guys, that wraps us up for now. Get those projects done. Have a great day. Enjoy your weekend. Later.